Now, I believe overnight you've got some very special pictures, and so I think we're actually going to show some pretty remarkable photos before we jump into our conversation. You want to give a little bit of context?
Yes, so I thought it was quite fortuitous. I thought it's a good way to start. It's always good to start with fluffy animals. Last night, when I was going through my email, I got these great photos come through.
Oh, very cool.
And this is from our site in Botswana, Moteo, and there was a mother cheetah with 4 cubs on one of our topsoil stockpiles having a look at the construction that was going on.
Amazing.
So our environmental manager got out there and took some photos.
That is very good iPhone camera work, can I just say. That's not a bad image to have captured.
No, and I think also it kind of captures the conversation we're having, which is that, you know, nature and mining can actually work together.
Well, and let's jump into that. I never like to assume particularly when we're introducing terminology that's perhaps a little bit newer to the industry than other things, that we have a universal understanding. So can you just ground us in what do we mean when we say nature positive before we start talking about what it looks like?
Yeah, so, well, I think let's separate the two. So let's talk about nature. So nature has been kind of redefined, I suppose, at the policy level. And I'm not talking about Australian policy, I'm talking about from a multilateral policy level at the UN, you know, through the Biodiversity Convention. And it's very much including things like freshwater, marine, ecosystem services, biodiversity, so genetic materials, animals, the living sphere. It's kind of become this really big encompassing term. The positive side of it is really just kind of a bit of an economic take on it. So if you understand nature as being of value, then what we want is we want credit. You know, we want more money in the bank, not less money in the bank. And so that's really what the nature positive is about. It's about how do we actually halt where we are at the moment, which is extinction, on our way to like serious extinction when it comes to biodiversity. How do we stop that? And how do we actually reverse it and get into more of, you know, back in the black, to coin, you know, Josh Frydenberg term. But how do we get there?
Sure.
That's right. And that's really what nature positive is about. It's about getting back in the black when it comes to nature.
So when we spoke, one of the things I found interesting is you were of the view that perhaps the nature positive branding has sort of moved into territory. It's been hijacked for something that's actually of quite little consequence, almost sort of a window dressing version of it. If we were to go back to a first principles approach, what would that look like?
So I think for me, a first principle approach on nature is, you know, let's understand that we have a intricate, connected relationship, and very interconnected with nature. And it's not just our industry, because our industry does actually have that, but it's more just in terms of just as people as well. We have a lot of economic activity that is reliant on nature. I think there was a let me just check exactly. I think it was a World Economic Forum which came out and said over half of GDP, global GDP, is going to be impacted if we don't actually start to address the problems that we have with nature. So I think this, you know, the student beforehand spoke about disconnect. I think just disconnect as a theme is kind of a good word. I think we've become very disconnected from our reliability on nature. On services in nature that we take advantage of, on basic things like water, and the availability to use water, both in our processes and in our industries, but also just, you know, turning on the tap at home.
So why do you think there's such a disconnect, maybe moving away from the individual at home, but more to the industry standpoint? Why don't you think we're seeing more engagement or more activity around this topic?
So I think it's... I think it's being driven kind of by this global discourse. I think that there's been a lot of success with the way the climate agenda has been tackled by, you know, both at a policy level but also at an industry level. I think
these feel so inextricably linked,
they
don't they?
Absolutely, and they are linked. Like the nature, you know, the crisis in climate. So climate change is impacting the rate of biodiversity loss as well. It's impacting those ecosystems, it's impacting water availability, it's impacting all these things. So you can't actually talk about the two separately. So I think as we're becoming more familiar with the impacts of climate change, as we're understanding those risks more, so we're seeing this connection between the nature and the climate debate. And I think I've been in biodiversity for a long time. I started working my career working at the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, and that was a good 20 years ago. And it was, even at that point in time, I can say there was a little bit of a disconnect between how society understands its dependencies on these ecosystem services, and then how we actually bring those into the mainstream and the mainframe and conversation. Because nobody wants to kill cheetahs. I showed you those photos. Nobody wants to be, nobody wants to be the person that destroys those environments. No industry, and very few people take joy in that. So the question is, what do we need to do to make sure that we can keep this, this capital around? Nature is capital. How do we make sure that we use it in a responsible way? And I think that's where this whole nature positive debate is coming from. I think also just in terms of the mechanism, finding the metrics, changing the language. I think the conservation lobby has really learnt off the climate discourse, and they've looked at TCFD, and now we've got TNFD. So there's a lot of learning from that whole climate conversation and trying to apply some of those lessons to try and get movement in the nature positive space as well. And I think, at the moment, we've got mandatory climate reporting. We will have mandatory nature reporting. I just don't know when, but I reckon that will happen soon enough.
Sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. So at the moment, it's all voluntary. And I think as an industry, we're all grappling with, what do we do in the nature space in TNFD? If you are part of that first wave of voluntary reporting in TNFD, or you've decided to do it, it's not easy.
Yep.
So I think that's really what's kind of going on. We're just seeing these multiplicities of events coming together.
So if I'm sitting here as someone that's maybe hearing this term for the first time, or isn't in an organisation that's already engaging in sort of voluntary reporting and the like, or maybe I'm thinking about, I get this, but there are stakeholders that I've got to go back to in my business and kind of make the case to engage around this agenda, and this kind of feels a little bit like a nice to do versus a imperative, bar that you've talked about the idea that a sticker's coming at some point. Could you make the elevator pitch for, commercial parties to get engaged and see the reason why? What does that look like for this nature positive agenda?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think there's a number of levels. So if I talk about it from our sector perspective,
please,
and I might just kind of spin my answer a little bit, but I actually think as a sector, mining could really lead when it comes to nature positive. I think that we've got vast amounts of land under our ownership or under our control. One of the goals when it comes to nature positive is to have 30% of our kind of terrestrial terrain under conservation. I think as a sector, we could absolutely lead in that area because we've got the land, because we're in environments like Botswana, like Papua New Guinea, like all these economies where we've actually got really rich nature value as well as ore value. So I believe that this is an opportunity for us to actually step up. We've been involved in managing nature through our land management processes, through rehabilitation planning and what we do in rehab. I think we have a huge amount of knowledge that's already there. And I think now some of these kind of international frameworks are just giving us a little bit of structure and kind of a common language, maybe, to be able to really excel and have some kind of competitive advantage in that space as a sector.
And supporting this idea, I mean, one of the things we've sort of flagged in the title here is we talk about this adage all the time that what we measure matters.
Yeah.
How should we think about measurement? How should we think about success if we're talking about how a company might define this versus the kind of more macro policy setting?
Yeah, so the measuring, this is where the conversation is at the moment, right? So it's all around the metrics. How do we measure something that is, in the past has been really rather unmeasurable, like it's very difficult. And there is a lot of this codification and translation. A lot of it is about language. a lot of it is about understanding nature, excuse me, as an economic, as an economic value, and then applying economic terminology. And we did this with climate really well. So we treated carbon pollution as an externality. The minute we brought it in-house and we internalize it with carbon price, for example. Thank you.
You're right.
It's what happens when you talk a lot at a conference.
So it sounds like an IMARC well had.
Yeah, that's
good.
right, exactly. So where was it? Climate change,
Yeah.
So we internalize that externality, and I think we can do the same with nature. I think it's just going to take a little bit of time, but I think, you look at MPI, for example, they've got a consultation paper out at the moment. So that's the Nature Positive Initiative. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I would definitely suggest that you take a look at their website. It's a range of NGOs that have come together to find this common measuring tool, so some commonality around measuring abundance, measuring resilience in nature, and then trying to quantify that in a way that we can use it as some kind of financial proxy. So we can start to incorporate nature value or erosion in our financial models. And that will make it much easier to make decisions, I think, broadly. And I think also just, it acknowledges the fact that this nature is an enormous contributor to the global economy. We rely on things like, water treatment from nature. We rely on pollination for agriculture, for our food. So there are a lot of what used to be called ecosystem services that are now being valued in a way that they can get properly incorporated into economic activity. And I think that's where the discussion is at the moment.
And if we think about the idea of, what practices need to change or be transformed in order to support this, from an industry standpoint, I mean, you've mentioned rehabilitation and things like that, aspects where there's naturally an obvious opportunity. Where do you see as being the challenge or the thing we maybe need to have a more uncomfortable or difficult problem-solving conversation about?
The challenge is always when it comes to money.
Yep.
Right? So, yes, please do sustainability, but don't spend any money on it. And I think this is where we need to have a bit of a shift in our mindset. So we have to understand the value that working connected with our natural environment actually brings to our people and our assets. Yep. Water's a great one. So water's part of the nature, umbrella. We all rely on water for our processes. We also often are in jurisdictions where there's a lot of water scarcity to start off with. They're semi-arid environments. And now that most of us have done our physical climate risk assessments, I would be very surprised if we didn't have water scarcity as kind of our top five, one of our top 5 risks in terms of impact to our businesses. So water is intrinsically connected with nature. How we manage water as a resource, how we understand its value in our assets, how we design our mining processes in a way where we actually can close loop our water, and we're already doing a lot of work on this. And then I think there's the other side where we can actually invest in nature-based technologies, which in some instances are actually cutting the costs of engineering technologies, and use those more in our processes. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that. You look at things like wetland systems. They're using a lot of wetland rehabilitation now for water treatment. We're using mangrove rehabilitation to support, to kind of reinforce along ports and control flooding. So we're acknowledging the value that these ecosystem services contribute to us as a society. I think what we just need a little bit more of is more creativity in our sector to incorporate them. I think we're definitely starting a lot of, especially in water treatment, for example. I think just in terms of groundwater, the oil and gas industry is doing a lot of work using natural bugs and things like that to clean up groundwater, understanding those microenvironments. So there is a lot that we can do. And I think also the other point that I wanted to make is that we've made as a sector, big contribution to biodiversity conservation, and it's not often acknowledged. We do have mines or mining companies that have dedicated big areas of land to conservation, especially in Africa. And they still maintain and manage that land as part of their own budgets. We do, in part of our environmental impact assessments, when we're doing if it's greenfields or an approval process, we go out and we look for species. And there's been a number of times where mining companies have found species that have previously not been discovered. And then we've put that on a register and we've worked with those species. And these are species that are not necessarily, the fluffy, cute things everyone likes to think of when they think about biodiversity. We're talking about benthic organisms, things like that, worms and critters and bugs and, the things that in some ways are actually fundamentally valuable in ecosystems. They're just not discussed because they don't look like those cute cheetahs, but, they're just as important.
Tzila, I'm really grateful for this conversation. One of the things I've really taken from it is that we need to skate to where the puck is going. There is not too far away a moment where international policy settings look like they will be creating expectations on our organisations to be reporting on this and operating in a manner that is nature positive as an extension or an evolution of the work that we're already doing from an ESG standpoint today. So a really useful thing to have on your radar to think about the creativity and equally the conversations that need to be having to begin the evolution of practice and metrics in support of this. Tzila, thank you so much for being here at IMARC.
Thank you. Thanks, Holly.
Can you join me in thanking Tzila?